Thanks, Abby. So if Boston is almost ready to give their report, let me just remind everybody what the format of this time together is. The first portion of the call, we'll have an opportunity to hear from Boston University School of Theology as to how their process is going. I see that you're in Dean Mary Elizabeth's office. So that's wonderful. We're glad to have you together and hear from you on your process. And then we'll shift into a time where we can have a focused conversation with Beth Norcross on section A.3 of the certification standards. And do take advantage of that, what do you call it, Abby, chat box, where you can offer questions or suggestions or whatever that we can bring into our conversation together. And then the third portion is kind of wide open. Anybody and everybody, anything that you need to talk about as it pertains to the certification program, we'll be glad to discuss together. And we have these calls every month on the fourth Wednesday of the month. So next month will be May 23rd. Anything else, Abby? Are we ready to get started? Okay. Jen and Dean Moore, and looks like Rebecca. Hello. Is your team ready? We'd love to hear from BU about how things are going and what goals that you've identified that you're excited about, or questions or concerns or just whatever. Let's see. And are you on mute?
Okay. Sorry about that. I accidentally hit the power button on my computer. Yes, we have Mary Elizabeth Moore, Rebecca Copeland, and I don't want to press that button again, and Hazel Johnson, and she's a second-year MDiv student here at BU, and we have Kevin Keith. What's your official title?
Director of Finance and Administration.
There we go. So I will let Mary Elizabeth start us off.
Right. I'll say a word about Hazel, who wasn't on our last team. You haven't seen her face before, but she's done work on environmental racism in the past. And quite a leader in our community. She's just been elected to her second year as president of the Student Association.
Wonderful.
So
nice to meet you all.
A busy and very effective leader.
Welcome, Hazel, and thank you.
Kevin thinks I'm just like mediocre. Which I'm with him. We're all best friends right now. So.
We thought we'd just do snapshots, and so we'll do them briefly. Snapshots. Some of the bigger things we've accomplished in the more recent future. Some of what's going on with our buildings, which Kevin will share. Some of what's going on in our courses, which Becky will share, and then one of the most challenging challenges, which Jen will share, and then I'll do a quick wind-up thing at the end. But basically, that was what we had in mind. Just
right. That's perfect.
Okay. Looking at opportunities as well as challenges. So in the recent past, we've done two big things, and we talked about both of them in the blog. But you'll see, we have some pictures that I'm not sure we can get onto the screen. But the first big thing we did was to gut our basement and to create a green, hospitable, accessible community center. And that it was a very expensive undertaking, but it was certified at the gold level by LEED. So we were thrilled because this is a very old building, 1949, and to do a renovation like that could be certified at such a high level, we thought was a very good thing. The purpose being to create a space that would inspire us to take new steps. And so the picture didn't work.
Do you know how to send a picture? I was looking at the chat option, but I don't see a upload picture link.
Can they share their screen?
You should be able to share your screen, or I can perhaps get you to share screen.
So it's not such a big deal. I took a picture of the plaque because it kind of gives the philosophy in one sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Also took a picture of, I went through old pictures and I filmed one of our art exhibits within that space. So we do an annual art exhibit that includes, we do a lot of art exhibits, but at least one a year is focused on environmental themes.
Mm.
So the second big thing is that we went through the process of becoming certified as a green school in the university. And as far as we can tell, we're the first certified green school. There's some green departments and green offices and so forth, but we did the school and we were certified at the gold level there.
Wonderful.
Jen will explain that process because she's the one who led it and did all the hard work.
Yeah, so the Green School certification is through a university-wide organization called Sustainability at BU. And as far as I'm aware that this green certification is fairly new, and as Mary Elizabeth said, we're the first school to go through it. It pretty much focused a lot on building aspects. So they had a spreadsheet kind of like you guys do that we had to fill out, and we got various points. And so a lot of it was like, how are we using our water? How, you know, like how are we managing the lights? Do we use compostable stuff during meal times? And so it was all very facilities related. And some of that actually included some habits. So we had to do a certification process for all the faculty and staff that had an office. So an intern from their organization would come and do kind of an audit in offices. We also had to do a transportation survey. So people that are commuting in, like faculty and staff, did a survey to see, are people using alternative methods of getting into work? So those were just some of the components. And as Mary Elizabeth said, we were able to reach the gold standard for that certification.
Way to go.
Don't turn it off.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so we have a few projects underway, and then also I'll talk about a couple of challenges that we face here at our school. To start with challenges, the first one's the one that we all face, it's funding. It's a lot easier as a school to raise money for scholarships or things like that as opposed to strictly environmental renovations. It's something we're working on. It's something we've demonstrated some success in. The basement project that Dean Moore spoke about earlier, we carved out from our budget and raised about 1.2 million total to pay for the whole renovation. It was a difficult process and it took a long time, but we got it done. And we went through the LEED certification process, which was expensive in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Other major challenge we face is just the building itself. It's a building that it's essentially brick and concrete, and it was built in 1949, and it shows every bit of it being built then. So we have to get really creative with what we can do with our space and how we do it. That was one of the major issues we faced with the basement. You know, we run into asbestos pretty much everywhere we go. You know, some walls are load-bearing walls that you wouldn't think are, but they just are because the building was built so long ago. So I think those two combined are probably the biggest challenge we face whenever we're doing any renovation, especially when we're trying to look at kind of the green aspects and how environmentally friendly we can make the space. But we currently have some projects underway. We are looking at renovating all of our bathrooms from our first to our fourth floors. And everything we do is, you know, we're going to put in low flow fixtures, toilets and sinks, efficient lighting, sensors on the lighting, so when people aren't in the bathroom, the lights go off, they don't stay on the entire time. Basically modeling everything we did when we were working through the LEED process in our basement, we want to do to the bathrooms at the rest of the levels of the school. Even to the point of reducing the number of fixtures in some bathrooms where I think we're able to. This school used to be a men's dormitory, First floor men's bathroom it's like a train station. It's the size of any other bathroom in the building. So we could easily reduce that by half.
Right,
And that would save a fair amount of both energy and water.
right, right.
Another project we're working on is the 3rd and 4th floors of our building. Since we've done our basement renovations, when you're in the basement, you feel like you're not. And when you're in the 3rd and 4th floor, you feel like you are. So we're really just going to try and, it's aesthetics mostly, but everything we do will be, low VOC paint, energy efficient lighting, the same sensors in the hallway so they dim when people aren't necessarily walking around. The tiles on the floor. We're again going to run into asbestos, so we're going to have to go through the process of getting that remediated.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's pretty much where we stand now.
Wow.
Oh, can I just do a follow-up to Kevin real quick? Yeah, just as a quick follow-up to Kevin, you're able to tell that we're a very urban school. So a lot of our building work has very little to do with grounds because we have almost no control of the grounds surrounding our building. We're also a nested community inside of a building that we share with other departments. So there's a lot of limits that come as a result of being an old school, an urban school, a nested school. But we've spent a lot of time on the building, I think partially as a result of that and partially as some of the skills that we have of the people amongst us. And so some of what we're going to be focusing on in the future and why we're excited about the Green Seminary Initiative is we can now really focus more on some of the cultural things that are happening and academic things that are happening in our community. So I think from there, I can turn it on to Hazel.
Yeah, hi, hello again. I wanted to speak a little bit to sort of student interest and concerns around this topic. So one is that, so there is a student group, maybe you've already shared about ecology, which sort of heads a lot of this. But I think as a student body, one, as a response to some of the things that students have seen, particularly around the bathrooms, sometimes feeling like a basement level, really being able to voice that to faculty and staff and that being heard, so even in the creation of this committee as well. The other is we have these town halls, sort of platforms for students to be able to share their desires and hopes. And so our very first one last fall, we identified 3 priorities. One of them, sort of all of this bubbled up from the students, one of them being around ecological action. And so even things like having compostable plates and forks for our community lunchtime, and even outside of, that's a Wednesday, but even sort of Monday through Friday, when people are here, you see folks recycling without being, asked to do so. A lot of folks carry, I'll show you what is sort of like the staple thing, which is sort of, I think it's bamboo, is it bamboo?
Yeah.
Usable utensils. We have water bottles that students get when they enter into the seminary. Mm-hmm. It is very, do as much as we can to support the students to be able to support this initiative on both an individual and collective level. So there's a lot of interest. So it's much more than the few of us that you see here.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
We're going to shift toward courses and co-curricular activities.
Okay, Becky?
And so our courses have been one of our strengths. We have about 10 different courses that focus specifically on environmental issues or things that are related to that, from Christian ecology, ethics, ecological ethics and political issues, to a travel seminar to Acadia National Park, to theology and the environment, or Christianity and climate change. So we have about 10 different courses that are specifically directed towards environmental issues. And we try to offer 2 of these courses a year. And most of them run at least every 2.5 years. So that those are in cycle course students that are interested. We also have ecological issues incorporated into some of our other courses, spending a class session on ecological issues in the required introductory survey, Christianity, Engaging Modernity, but also in stewarding, contextual education, evangelism, introduction to ethics, and transformative leadership. I think one of the challenges is with the electives that you get the people who are already interested, but they tend to be smaller classes. And so one of the ways that we want to push, not push against, but to increase interest in that is through those other courses and incorporating this into other courses. And towards that end, I plan to weave ecological issues not into one class session, but throughout the whole semester in another introductory survey course, Introduction to Christian Traditions, that all of the first years will be taking. And we're also interested in seeing if that can be incorporated more into Intro to Worship and Intro to Preaching courses students will be taking. We've really liked the ideas provided by Green Seminary Initiative and are interested in trying to develop more of those 1 and 2 credit courses that can provide a lower threshold entryway into these ideas. And we've also talked about developing, next year I intend to start a religion and ecology colloquy for both master's and doctoral students. And we've also talked about the possibility and the steps that we're going to need to look at to develop a certificate in ecological studies or religion ecology, something to that effect. Should I do events too? We do 1 to 2 events a year that are focused on environmental themes. It's not necessarily coordinated through any one group. It sort of comes up through a variety of different groups. And so one of the things we've seen is we need probably some more coordination. 2 weeks ago, the Anna Howard Shaw Center sponsored their Women in the World Conference, Am I the Earth's Keeper? Climate Change and Earth Community. Seeing Moore preached at chapel. I delivered the keynote, and we had wonderful workshops being led by our students, including ecofeminism and environmental degradation, Puerto Rico post-Hurricane Maria, ecological devastation and white supremacy, and earth-keeping activities. So we've got events like that we're doing, but we want to do it more intentionally incorporated into the life of the community.
Excellent. Excellent. Dean Moore, did you have some closing remarks?
Yeah, we have, Jim was going to name one of our biggest challenges, and I was going to say one more thing, and then we're
Right.
Yeah, so one of the challenges that we have that I'm sure happens at a lot of other schools too is that environmental issues gets posited as somewhat of a niche issue. And so, we have all these offerings that are available, and yet sometimes there's really low turnout, or there's just kind of a lack of student energy. So Hazel mentioned a town hall meeting that we had in the fall, where environmental issues were one topic amongst many. In the spring, we had another town hall where sustainability was the sole topic, and we only got a few stragglers. And a lot of the people that were there were from our GSI committee. It was very preaching to the choir situation. Last week we also, or 2 weeks ago, I can't remember, we had an advisory board meeting with Dean's advisory board, and Mary Elizabeth's sense was that the energy in the room, that folks just weren't as engaged, partially because they're just own lack of maybe awareness or deep personal concern for the topic at hand. And so I think an ongoing thing is just to figure out, how do we help students connect the ideas to the things that they already care about? We're a very social justice oriented school, and we can get lots of people to turn out for like an anti-gun violence event, but not so much for a climate change related event. So how do we increase that student interest? How do we increase faculty engagement? How do we communicate ourselves to groups like the advisory board, in order for everyone to internalize that this is a core part of our identity as a seminary, and that our faith, creates some sort of moral demand on us to be concerned about the earth. So that's what we're going to be thinking about in the coming years.
Very good.
So the last word is that we learned from the survey something that we really were not fully conscious of.
What's that?
And that is that we do a lot of things that nobody knows about. And we need to increase the profile in order to generate more energy to respond to the issue Jen's put on the table. So we have a track in our MTS program, and we have a concentration within a track of our MDiv. Most students don't know that. So even students looking for ecologically oriented classes don't know about these things.
Right.
The events are created and they're always outstanding, but the word doesn't always get spread. So one of our issues is to make more visible the opportunities we have. And that's another challenge that we're facing, which is not an impossible challenge at all, but we think that might be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
The end.
Very good. Very outstanding.
We welcome whatever others have to share.
If anyone has a question for Boston University School of Theology, offer them in the chat box and we can come back to them in the last part of our call. I want to shift gears and introduce to you Beth Norcross, and she may have a word or a question or a comment to BU. But I'd also like to I look forward to her facilitating a focused conversation with us on the certification program standards that are called A.3, Eco-Spiritual Formation. That's a section, all of you are very familiar now with the standards. And so Beth, of course, is the co-founder, along with Laurel Kearns, of the Green Seminary Initiative, and she's the executive director of the Center for Spirituality and Nature. So Beth?
Well, thank you, Sarah. And I do have one word for BU. Wow. It's really quite extraordinary. And working with seminaries over the last 10 years of the GSI, this kind of thing is really music to our ears. And I hear the obstacles and I hear the challenges, but I also hear all this marvelous work that you've been doing, and I really, really applaud. I know it's not easy, so thank you so much for your efforts down up there. So before I get to the topic at hand, I just want to introduce myself by telling you just one sentence or two about the Center for Spirituality and Nature so you know where I'm coming from. I'm also adjunct faculty at Wesley Seminary, where I teach a couple of classes on spirituality and nature and greening your congregation. At the center, what we're trying to do is encourage people through experience in nature to have what we call a loving, lived relationship with the earth and the divine. And we do that through individual programs, through work with congregations in forming their own spirituality and nature groups. And as of last month, we've just started a brand new monthly Church of the Wild, where we were blown away by the 60 odd people who showed up in our very small little space that we had aside. And I say that by way of introducing this topic, that there is great yearning out there for direct, unmediated relationship with God in the natural world. And it's something that at the Green Seminary Initiative, we felt from the get-go that we needed to include in the certification standards. The question, of course, was where? Because it really does permeate all aspects. So I'll talk more directly about what we were thinking about in terms of these scholastic or academic standards, but knowing that you can see ripples of this certainly in buildings and grounds and worship and community life and so forth. So I'll do a couple of things today in my part of the presentation, and then I'd really like to hear more from you. We wanted to talk, first of all, about what do we mean when we say eco-spiritual formation? And secondly, why is it important? Why did we feel that we needed to do this? Spiritual formation is often something that gets ignored and left behind under more ostensibly pressing matters. We're all about doing, and sometimes forget to do that foundational work. Well, eco-spiritual formation is no exception to that. So first of all, what do we mean when we say eco-spiritual formation? Well, we have a description of it on our certification standards. And it goes something like, and you can look at it yourselves, but to enhance students' understanding and appreciation of the breadth and depth of ecological-based spirituality. And we understand it as an appreciation of this spiritual experience in relation to the world, and so forth and so on. well, what do we mean by that? I think simply from my standpoint, and I'll note that in looking at all these wonderful faces, I see many of you who have given this a great deal of thought over the years and have your own opinions and thoughts around what this means. I can only offer mine to you, and we can have a rich conversation perhaps later about what it means. But for us, it means simply that process by which we seek God in ourselves, in each other, and in the broader community of the earth. The process by which we then open ourselves to God's desires, not only for ourselves, but for each other and for the broader community of the earth. And thirdly, that process by which we strengthen ourselves for the action or the response or that lived loving relationship that I talked about a moment ago. And that brings in things like resilience. And it does have an eco-justice component, but it's a little bit different than how we address eco-justice in our other standards. Again, that process by which we strengthen ourselves, we get ourselves ready, we gird ourselves, if you will, for the action that we need to do in behalf of the earth. So why is this important? Well, as I said before, this spiritual formation is often something that gets left behind. And I'm going to raise 3 reasons why we think it's important. Of course, there are many, many more. Firstly, congregations and communities need this time in nature. And as we equip our leaders of tomorrow to deal with the complexities of congregational life and a planet that's in imminent danger, we're equipping them to be in congregations and in communities. And why do I say communities and congregations need this? First of all, as you all know better than I, these congregations and communities are clamoring for more direct spiritual experience. I hear it all the time in the work that we do. Their people are busy, they're overtaxed, they are looking for space and time and Sabbath. And what better place to do that than in the natural world? Secondly, in regard to why congregations, communities need this, is that, and again, we're seeking to equip our leaders to provide this to their congregation and communities, is that this spiritual formation, this time in nature, is, in my view, the oldest and perhaps the first way of understanding the divine, of understanding God. It's all over our scriptural traditions and our Christian traditions. And by cutting ourselves off from this way of knowing God, we cut ourselves off by a very important and perhaps essential way of understanding and experiencing God. And so by the flip of that, of course, is by bringing this back into congregations, by equipping these young pastors and leaders to have these skills, then we introduce or reintroduce this very important and essential way of experiencing and knowing God. And lastly, in this congregational piece, I would say, as someone who spent a lot of time in the environmental community, we tried to talk people into understanding how important these environmental issues were, but sometimes we forgot to do that foundational relationship work. And so I would suggest to you that this going back into the natural world, forming relationship with God and earth and all of its creatures, provides us this relationship, this love, if I can call it that, this connection, which then forms the basis of this behavioral transformation that we're all trying to do through our work in the seminaries. So in addition to that congregational reason, again, as we are equipping these pastors and leaders, the second thing I would mention is that it strengthens those individuals themselves for ministry. We all know, and I see faces here of seminary students, they're overworked, they're overwrought, they're seeking Sabbath, they're looking for places for space. And what a wonderful opportunity for them to get that in the natural world. There's a wonderful new book, Nature RX, that talks about how soothing and healing and comforting nature can be. And I would suggest to you that for individuals that are seeking to go into ministry, this way of providing solace and comfort and healing to them is very, very important. And the third thing that I would mention, in addition to the congregational component and the individual strengthening for ministry component, is that it offers this eco-spiritual formation, offers an opportunity to the entire seminary community to come together in a new way. All the seminary community could use time in nature for comfort, for healing, for space, for Sabbath, but also to redefine itself outside of just the human community, but also to include the broader earth community as well. So that is, in a nutshell, why we think this is such an important piece. So then the question begins to be asked, how do we do this? And the best advice, of course, is embedded in the certification requirements themselves. That's our best thinking. In individual coursework being offered on, I do a course at Wesley in spirituality and nature that's been very well received in the elective classes, but also in integration through existing classes, and as I said, all the other components outside of academics, worship, grounds, field education, and so forth. So I think that I'll stop there and open it up. Again, there are a lot of wonderful minds who've given this a lot of reflection, but in a nutshell, we believe very strongly at the Green Seminary Initiative that this eco-spiritual formation can provide really important foundational work to all that behavioral transformation that we're trying to do in our seminaries. So I'll just turn it back over to you now and to Sarah and Abby and see how we want to open this up for conversation. First of all, I just would ask what your reaction is to this and your response is to my definition of this and the importance with which I place this, and then talk a little bit about how we can do that in our individual seminaries. Sound like a plan, Sarah and Abby?
Sure. So first, any response to Beth's description of what eco-spiritual formation is and why it's important in a seminary and theological education? Or anyone want to expand?
Bill, do you want to say more about what this means?
Only after I unmute myself. So I think that was great, Beth. Thank you so much. One thing that Columbia is thinking about implementing for the next several years is an emphasis on health and wholeness for students, for the community, and that should have an ecological component as well. So I can easily see this as a not just an extra dimension, but a foundational dimension to what it means to be healthy and whole. Not just individually, not just within our communities, but but as well as the earth and the planet. So thank you for stimulating that within my context. I can also imagine some pushback on eco-spirituality, because from older generations, and I think they still may be present in our some of our faculty as well, is isn't that pagan? And I'm here to say, no, it isn't. It's deeply rooted in biblical faith and theology and such. So, so I can just imagine some pushback on that, but I think that can be easily overcome. So thank you for, in a very articulate way, a very compelling way of carrying that forward. So just affirmation.
I think Mary Elizabeth, if you would unmute, there you go.
Oh, thanks. I might add that I think this, the subject you just named opens us to drawing from a lot of different ethnic and global traditions as well. I'm sure you've worked with Diane Glave in the DC area, but Diane Glave spoke here a couple of years ago and talked about how the African American churches had never left the environment. It had always been a part of their cultures, pre and post Christian. But I think that we have a lot to learn from cultures around the world and from different ethnic communities within the United States. So your presentation stirs my desire to learn a lot more.
If I could just respond to that, I think that's very true, and we certainly Native American traditions and other religious traditions, and this notion of particularly, and I hesitate to speak for the African American community, but this rich history of as Christianity was coming into African American culture, they're making it their own, and by the earth being that place that was safe to practice their own brand of Christianity is really compelling to some of the students at Wesley, I know, and it bears some further investigation. To Bill's point about some pagan pushback, certainly, yes, always, it is in eco-spirituality. And what I've been able to try to do at Wesley is always come back to those very strong Christian scriptural traditions that Bill mentioned. The Adam from Adamah, I mean, it's really in the book. As I tell my students, we don't have to make it up. It's in the book. So that gives us the grounding that sometimes we need to respond to some of that pushback.
This is Tim Eberhard from Garrett Evangelical. A few different thoughts here. One, just further affirmation of the importance of the kind of coursework that I know Beth offers, which is learning, teaching, reflecting within landscapes, getting outside of the traditional classroom. And I've heard Beth speak about the different geographies that her class traverses within the DC area, which intersects with histories of race and racism. And I think this is a crucial point to make here in terms of thinking about spiritualities in connection with geographies, place, and nature, that it's not just, and it may be a tendency of kind of white middle class spiritual seekers to seek solace, healing, connection, but that we also name the histories of trauma and violence that are associated with particular geographies. So, you know, I, as a Midwestern raised South Dakotan, can drive through rural areas in the fall and adore the golden cornfields, though now with a critical eye toward monocrop agriculture. But to hear from Black colleagues about the fear of traveling through those same geographies and what they represent and ties to KKK and others. Similarly, someone like Carolyn Finney and Black Faces, White Spaces, that book, the traumas associated for Black communities with forests and ties with lynching. And so as we extend our classrooms out into to the so-called natural world, that we do so with layers of complexity, you know, recognizing both the deep sources of healing and connection, but also the layers of trauma and violence and genocide, I mean, that are also layered into these spaces. And I think there's actually a connection here with the pagan conversation here in terms of even for those of us who come from European roots, the ties to the removal of people from a landscape, the demonization of pagan simply just means rural or countryside, that those who are tied with the land, women spiritual healers, those whose skin color is more closely associated with dirt, that somehow these are of the devil, that they are frightening, that they are to be feared and rejected. So I think alongside deeply affirming how an ecological worldview is rooted in Scripture and Christian tradition, we also push back against some of the scare tactics, which have been used to push people off land, to create racial hierarchies of domination. I mean, there's a lot there. So yeah, a really important conversation, Beth, that you're inviting us into.
Just a quick comment on that. I appreciate the awful lot there, Tim. And in particular, this idea of knowing your local sacred landscapes and getting to know them, getting our students to know them. We talk to our students about understanding in any community that they serve, they want to know it and get to know the neighbors. And so we broaden that at Wesley by getting to know our non-human neighbors. But also we, in this class, the summer class that I teach, and I'm happy, I think the syllabus is up on our site. I'm happy to send it to any of you, this week-long intensive class. We go to 5 sub-watersheds and we experience the trauma of the land, the healing of the land. When we go to a degraded river, the Anacostia River, traditionally running through people of communities of color, and seeing both the degradation but also the resilience of the river itself and the people along the river. And that's a whole lot more interesting and compelling than my talking about that in class. So really getting out onto the land and experiencing this, experiencing climate change, experiencing storm flow problems, stormwater problems. I mean, it's much, much more compelling than having these intellectual arguments in the classroom.
I would just offer the good news of our Earth Week celebration last week here at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology. I got a message from Faith a little bit ago, and she cannot be here this afternoon. She's in another meeting. But she wanted me to be sure and share with you about our Creation Fest week. We had meditations that we had written and provided on a local web place called STVU Live that students could go to each day. And we had a different focus for the meditations, one on soil, one on air, one on water, one on plants and vegetation, and one on animals and human life. And then at 12:15 every day, we gathered outside the chapel on the grounds of the campus and had different persons come and lead in a 15-minute prayer experience. We had someone come from Baptist General Convention, but we also had one of the imams come. We had a Universalist Sufi come and a rabbi come to share in those prayers on different days and lead them in whatever way that they wanted to share from their tradition. And we had two film showings, one on Wednesday night, which was a film sponsored by the Richmonders for Peace in Israel-Palestine, called Al-Helm, The Dream in Arabic, which is a film about a group of theater troupe from the U.S. and from Palestine who are performing a play about a play in which MLK's story is told. And so it was about the need for nonviolence and for encouraging a dream for life with young Palestinian boys and girls, men and women, drawing inspiration from MLK. Very, very compelling film. And then another film was called When All Hell Breaks Loose. It's the documentary about Turkey Creek in Louisiana, an African-American community that had been destabilized because of environmental issues before and post-Katrina. So we felt really, really good about the whole week, and it was an embodiment of the kinds of things that Beth has been talking about. And it was a good first one out of the gate for us, and we're excited to see what will happen the next time around. And it was capped off on Saturday morning in the seminary chapel with Reverend Ralph Hodge preaching a sermon. He's a scientist, teaches school as well as pastoring a church for 15 years. And his working of the three of the 6 days of creation was just dynamite. We hold our breath to see what was next going to come from him. It was just a tremendous worship experience. So we just give a lot of thanks for that opportunity to embody helping folks make that connection. And the other piece that I would say, particularly Beth, as you talk about sacred spaces, and Tim has spoken of them, is that on Friday afternoon, we had arranged a scavenger hunt so that persons would be pushed to go, and it was a high-tech scavenger hunt. You took a picture of yourself. The students were encouraged to take pictures of themselves at different points on the campus to get them into those sacred places, to get them into the different spaces on campus than what they might ordinarily be traveling. And then resource tables and fresh apples and water and those kinds of things at the conclusion of the scavenger hunt. So it was a good first event. We're very, very grateful for having had that opportunity. And it also raised consciousness much more about not only Green Seminaries, but how the whole university is trying to be more focused around our sacred use of the spaces that we already have around us.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. I'm noticing the time. Looks like we have about 10 minutes left, but I do want to mention Dennis's comment that some of you may have seen in the chat box in regards to spirituality related courses. He's recalling a Jan term course that he took at Columbia Theological Seminary a few years ago. That was a week-long hike involved a week-long hike on the Appalachian Trail. I can speak also from my own experience at Austin Presbyterian Seminary, a class that Bill Greenway used to offer called An Adventure in Wilderness and Spirituality, which was an experiential 2-week course. You didn't know where you were going. You couldn't take a watch or certainly a cell phone, but it was an experience in a seminary class that I continued personally to draw from. So those are some of the things that we can think about creatively looking at the certification program standards.
Sarah, if I could just, I know you're trying to move on, just one last closing comment. We do have a number of resources that you might find interesting and helpful on our website, which I just posted, but we've just put out a new book that has 50 spiritual practices specifically designed for the natural world that, again, if you find it interesting and helpful, that's terrific. And then also just quickly for our friends at BU and other places, nature can be most compelling in an urban setting. Actually, I had occasion to lead a group of philanthropists, environmental philanthropists, on an urban walk at 7 o'clock in the morning near DuPont Circle in DC. And the trees that were still standing strong in the middle of all that, offered lessons for resilience and that are really pertinent. So urban nature also, we don't always have to go to some really wonderful, quiet spot out in the middle of nowhere. And thanks very much. This has been a really rich and interesting conversation, and I've learned a lot, so thank you.
Well, and you may have some, but is someone trying to?
I
Can we
wanted
jump in?
can I add something very quick?
Yes, Hazel.
To your last point, Beth, about sort of looking at the different ways that one might be able to do like environmental justice. Recently, Jen hosted a panel here speaking to the question, is it bougie to be green? And the 3 panelists were all and one of the questions that they were asked is sort of like around this myth, particularly that Black folks don't care about the environment. And the responses were very beautiful. And one of the things that's standing out to me, particularly around your curriculum, which you mentioned here, about the sort of the myriad ways that people are engaging the environment, so that it helps us from an eco-spiritual perspective, not have like a 5 set ways that this is what it looks like to do eco-spirituality, that it could be something as simple as going to Acadia National Park or it is going down to do an action at the State House. But I think that opens it up to be able to give room for the many ways that communities of color, impoverished communities, indigenous communities are doing ecological active work, but it doesn't look the way that people sort of assumed it to be. So I really am interested in sort of your second point about the different ways that we could be with nature as opposed to just not opposed, but instead of just doing as a way to signify we're moving in some direction.
Yeah, thank you. We need to be in touch and talk more about that. I would love to be in conversation with you about that.
Thank you.
Great points. Any additional questions or comments for Beth or for the BU School of Theology? We are recording this video conference, and we will share this with you all and other members of your Green team. We also have a closed Facebook group that has a long name. I forget the name, Abby. Green Team, what is it?
Something about environmental cohort. I put the link in the chat box. So if you haven't yet joined the closed group, you can click over into that link and join us there. I've also included the link to our Facebook page, which often posts resources like the book that Beth mentioned, and then a link to our website, which always has resources that we're constantly trying to update. One of the things I'll be adding this week is a resource on liturgy and spiritual formation that is being curated by Garrett Evangelical, and we're really excited about it.
Awesome. We're having these calls once a month in order to continue this conversation. This is a reminder that we're not alone in this. You are part of a team at your school, and your team is a part of this constellation of creative thinking people. So we want to keep this conversation going and learn together and continue to encourage one another in this work that we're called to do. Next month's meeting will be May 23rd. I was thinking it's always the last Wednesday of the month. It's actually the fourth Wednesday of the month, because next month, May has, the last Wednesday is May 30th, but we're scheduled for May 23rd when we're going to hear from Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. And we're going to have our mentor on the call. Lisa Dayhill is going to facilitate a focused conversation with us on section B.1. We're going to shift from education focus area into the liturgy, ritual, and worship focus area next month. Abby, any closing thoughts? Are we good to go?
I don't think so. Just a reminder, as always, that Sarah and I are always willing to meet with all of you. Sarah is calling in from Trinity, and
I am.
And some of our favorite moments is when they get to meet with schools in person. And so please let us know if we can schedule a time to visit you. And we'll look forward to those in-person conversations. We really loved meeting and seeing many of the places that Boston talked about in their conversation today when we were there for AAR. And so we love getting to see the places that you all call home.
Right. Thanks so much to Boston University School of Theology. And Beth, thanks for your time on this call. And thanks for getting Green Seminary Initiative started 10 years ago. Good job.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay. See you next month.
Thank you.